I think it's the first time that I welcome people with the song The Final Countdown, which is quite ominous, to be honest. But dear all, it is my pleasure to welcome you all today to the aula of our beautiful Maastricht University. My name is Marielle Heltjes. I'm the Dean of the School of Business and Economics, and as Pro-Rector, I chair this academic ceremony, in which, of course, Professor Kool will deliver his valedictory lecture, Europe, The Final Countdown. And of course, also a very special welcome to Marijke, whose name I heard mentioned many times, and many with me. So it's really nice to be able to welcome you here also in person. And a special welcome, of course, to your daughters and their partners, your son, and of course, the grandchildren, of which I see some of them in the audience. Now, of course, last but not least, I also want to welcome my colleagues. It's this sea of people dressed in red on this very hot day, and I think that's really a testament to the rich history that Professor Kool has had here at this university. A rich history indeed, because Clemens has held positions elsewhere, but as most of you know, he always came back to Maastricht. His first term in Maastricht lasted 12 years. He came here in 1991. Then he left again in 2003 and he went to Utrecht University. He stayed there some years, but Maastricht University's call remained very strong. So he came back in 2016 and stayed here again until his formal retirement age. And if you're wondering, that was last year. And then he came back again. And despite that, a valedictory address, of course, usually signals a goodbye from a formal position at the school, this is not true for Clemens, as he will be back in his office, this time it's at UNU Married, I expect somewhere next week. So, today will not necessarily signify a goodbye, but I think it should signify more a celebration of your career as a scholar, as a teacher, as a colleague, and as a leader who has played an integral role in shaping our academic community here in Maastricht for many years. And ladies and gentlemen, Clemens' valedictory address will, of course, focus on his work in monetary policy, European integration, and macroeconomic stability, or lack thereof. And at the base of this is a very impressive track record that I will not further elaborate now, because I think Clemens can do a much better job in his valedictory address himself. But I would like to spend a little time before he gets the floor on his role as colleague and as a leader within the school. And as you might have guessed already from the many reappearances of Clemens in Maastricht, that he has been and still is a very active member of our community. During working hours, but also during the many extracurricular events, such as the Summa lecture or a Johan Muisken lecture that is being organized. He's a vocal colleague too, as I've never seen in my long history here also, Clemens shy away from voicing his opinion on matters that matter to him. And it's pretty darn hard to change his mind once he's convinced of something. So over the years, I think that has made him a really influential voice in many of our institutional discussions. And that remains the case also, I think, for at least the next half year to come. Another observation that definitely stands out and that is shared by many, I've been asking around a little bit about that, of course, is his ability to find a constructive and pragmatic way forward, even in very complex situations. And as one of his colleagues puts it, Clemens does not leave things for next time or later. He ensures that the decision is made on the spot, or that responsibility is clearly assigned and a follow-up date is set. He's clear and decisive, no matter how complex the question. And although I've also heard that this is a style that some colleagues in a university setting still sometimes have a hard time to get used to, it has brought very positive progress on many occasions. And while going through this and sort of looking at the common characteristic, I realized that these all paint a picture of you as if you were only and always only about work. And that is, of course, not true. For one, you're a very proud opa that you sometimes talk about. And I think your sense of fashion will go down into the SPE history books. Because like your colleague, Professor Emeritus Johan Muisken, who is known, or who became famous for his red-colored socks, you definitely leave a legacy with your trendy, inseparable neck scarves. But for this introduction to the festivity of today, I think on a personal note, it's enough for now, because later on, more people will get the floor here. So let us return to the more formal nature of this academic ceremony today, and that is your valedictory address. And as it is not a farewell, I invite you to see it as a moment to reflect and be inspired on the future of Europe, or maybe lack of future. We will soon find out. So, Professor Dr. Kool, the floor is yours to deliver your lecture entitled Europe, the Final Countdown.
Dear Pro-Rector, colleagues, students, family and friends here present and online in the live stream. You just listened to the final countdown. It was sung by the Swedish rock band Europe, what's in the name, in 1986. And it is about a spaceship setting off to Venus, saying goodbye to planet Earth. Some see it as an expression of escapism, leaving behind Earth in the dark 1980s, because indeed in the early 1980s, Western Europe was not a really happy period. The economy was generally down, there was mass unemployment, and the Cold War was at its peak. And as signals of that, anti-establishment movements appeared, but also the punk music. And on top of that, if you talk about disasters, 1986 also was the year of the Chernobyl disaster and the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger. However, also positive things happened in 1986. It was the year in which the Single European Act was signed. And this marked the starting point of a new and successful phase of deep European integration, including the creation of the single currency, the euro, and the European Central Bank. So, a more positive interpretation of this song is that it's the start of a new journey, taking a chance on the unknown. Today, almost 40 years later, again our future hangs in the balance, you could say. The current geopolitical situation, the apparent attacks from all sides on the multilateral world order, not to mention the global climate change threat, and national and populist sentiments, are good reasons to be pessimistic about the future of Europe. However, I believe that Europe can emerge stronger and more united from the current challenges and can remain a relevant global economic and political player with high norms and values where it's good to live. But this requires more, I think, than we have been doing so far. The question is what to do and how to do it. And that's what my talk today is all about. So my address today is about Europe and the euro, and the two of them now are almost irrevocably linked. I guess it's not a surprise to anybody who knows my research and teaching over the past decades that this is the topic I chose. And wow, what happens? What you should see now is something else, but I'll just continue. So let me briefly elaborate. I'm not going to speak my formal address, so it is written down, so I have proof of that. But it's, as you know, if you start writing, it becomes longer and longer, so it's too long. And if it's too long, then and too formal, it has footnotes and references, and etc. So I'm not going to read about it. Instead, what you will see outside when you get out is this type of flyers, which has a QR code. And if you then want to, download at some point in time the whole text, then you can do that. So I leave it at that. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell a story. It's my story, so it is about the facts, I think, but stories like this tend to have, yes, now it works. Stories like this tend to also be subjective. Economics is a social science, and that means that universal truths are hard to find. And going back to what I talked to you before, this is, let me see, yes. So this is a word cloud from a social network analysis which shows where my publications have centered on. And then, of course, you see monetary policy, banking, Europe, interest rates. So this is where I come from. But I'm going to tell you the story about European integration, where we come from, so how we prepared for the start of the euro, what we experienced over the past 25 years, and also what I think could be the next step. And to already, let's say, give away the secret, I think we need more Europe and not less. Now, since I'm going to try to tell the story in a way that also non-economists find interesting, I will do my best for that, but also that requires some effort from your side to go with me on my trip. So instead of sinking back and thinking, well, he's an economist, let's just sit it out, try to stay with me. Good, so where do we start? I start with the fact that, so I start with 1986. And in 1986 we had the Single European Act. European integration, of course, went back a long, long time, and we always have had a debate on political versus economic integration. And since political integration always got stalled because of differences between countries, economic integration typically was the way forward. And the Single European Act actually was a big step forward because it envisioned a Europe where the whole of the European Union would be one market. This was the time of market thinking, of neoliberalism, in which there would be no hurdles. You could trade goods and services freely across borders. You could work wherever you want in the European Union without borders. And you could move your money or your capital freely across borders. So that was something that in 1986 we decided. We said in the mid-90s it should be realized. There was a minor problem because at the time every country had its own currency. Some of you may still remember that. And because of that own currency, they had their own central bank. And each central bank could choose its own policy. So there was quite some lack of coordination. The exchange rate in between we tried to keep fixed. And one of the reasons we could keep it fixed despite the differences in monetary policy was that we had many barriers to capital that limited the speculative attacks on the exchange rate system. But everybody understood quite fast that if we would create this free mobility of capital, then the fixed exchange rate system would not be able to withstand any speculative attacks. So we needed a plan, and the plan was developed in the Delors period. Jacques Delors then was the president of the European Commission, and he commissioned a report which was issued in 1988, and the plan was very simple. We just do away with all the exchange rates because we just create one single currency. So then there's nothing to attack, was the idea. Smart thinking, you could argue, but then underneath was still the problem that all of these countries were structurally different. They not only had different monetary policies, we could define that away with one central bank, but we could not hide that countries had different focus in their economy. Some focused on agriculture, some focused on industry or services. There were differences in labor laws and labor markets. So these countries were different, and that in economic terms we then say they did not form an optimum currency area, and that means you're too different to have one currency. So how could we solve that? Well, Delors thought that by formulating specific criteria to see whether countries that complied with these criteria were, let's say, similar enough to get into the currency area, that we then would be safe. So the criteria were formulated in the Maastricht Treaty, 1992, this city, as you all know. And then we said every country has about 5 years to comply with that. Because if we want to start in 99, around 97, every country has to pass the exam. Did everybody pass the exam? The answer is no, but everybody was given the benefit of the doubt. So I said, well, let's continue. Not everybody was equally happy with that. So there was, you could say it was two sides. There were pessimists, and the pessimists said, listen, we all know we are structurally different. We may have one currency and one central bank, but we still have lots of other differences. And we really do not believe that there will be no new shocks. So if new shocks happen, and they will be unexpected, then instead of the exchange rates that did the buffering and did the adjustment after the shock, something else has to be done. So they said, if we go ahead, at least we need the safety net. And if not, there will be crisis and collapse. So they predicted a very short lifespan for the euro. Now, the optimists also agreed that there was not an optimal currency area. However, they said, listen, we now have one monetary policy, we have fiscal policy disciplined by the criteria, and we have the European Commission to check whether every country complies with the responsible behavior of each government. And as a sort of a backstop, we have financial markets. So if the financial markets see that countries do not behave responsibly, they will punish them by asking higher interest rates, and that will be sufficient reason for governments to go back in their tracks and to behave. I see some of my colleagues smiling. So they said, and given that most shocks come from the monetary or fiscal policy side, we're safe. No more shocks will happen, and therefore also no safety net is needed. And the beautiful thing is, they said, if we now also impose that nobody can help a country that gets into trouble, that is even a better guarantee that no country will get into trouble, because every country then will know that it has to discipline itself. So when we say, sure, you can join, but it's all on you if it goes wrong, then that country will not go wrong because they know that the punishment will be severe. The other thing the optimist said was, as soon as we have the euro, we will become more similar. So maybe we are not really good to go now, but we will be good to go in a couple of years. So we converge, and then we will be all happy together. So what happened? So we're now 25 years later, and after 25 years, we can look back and see how the euro did. And I have to say that in 1996, I did my inaugural address in this university, and it also was about Europe, and I was one of the pessimists. And for years afterwards, people were at birthday parties and at family celebrations. People would say, uncles, aunts, they would say, where is the crisis you said might come? And I said, yes, sorry, it's not happened yet. And that was up till, so this is the starting phase. So we started off by saying, we ride as a group, but if you get a flat tire or if you end up at the side of the road, then please take care of it yourself. So up till 2007, I faced many difficult questions of my family about my predictions in '96. And then we got the financial crisis. And this graph is the European Policy Uncertainty Index. It's not a measure like income or unemployment. It is a sort of the emotional thermometer of economics. It is what people get out of the, so what analysts get out of the newspapers, and the more words like uncertainty and problem and crisis appear in the newspaper, the higher this uncertainty index is rising. And what you see is indeed, until 2007, it was a bit up and down, but nothing major happened. And then we had an increasing number of peaks, and it's not that difficult to relate the peaks to real-world events. And I've given the labels here. So we started off with the global financial crisis and the euro debt crisis in the period 2007-2012. Then we had Brexit in 2016. We had the COVID-19 episode from 2020 onward, and we had the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022 with the consequent energy crisis, and then of course the last peak, late 2024, most likely is the uncertainty surrounding the effects of the US elections. So what did we do? Remember, this was all against the idea we ride together, but it's everyone for himself. So what did we do? The first accident happened in, let's say, already in 2008 or 2009 with banking crisis in many European countries, but the major hit came in 2010, 2011, when the Greek debt situation was suddenly exposed to be much more vulnerable than everybody thought. I'm not going to treat each crisis in turn, because that would take much more time than I have and you have. So there is a few common denominators of what all of these shocks share. One is that in each of these crises, the effects are asymmetric. That means there was a crisis, but countries were differently affected. For example, in the global financial crisis and the euro debt crisis, the hit was typically going to countries with a weak banking sector and a weak government. Southern Europe. There the major hit came. Then, of course, we had the next one in COVID, and there the vulnerability mostly came from industrial structure, from the fact that countries that had a lot of hands-on work, tourism, faced much more difficulties than, for example, a country like the Netherlands, where we do a lot with services and people could work from home. With the energy crisis, it had to do a lot with energy dependence. How much were we dependent on the Russian gas? And that was different for all of these countries. So there's a common denominator, asymmetric effects. And we have no exchange rates anymore. So the second common denominator is that in each time when it was needed, the ECB, the European Central Bank, and the European Union came to the rescue. They did it in many different ways. If you want to read my lecture, my speech itself, then you can see all the details. I'm not going to talk about it now here. But all of these rescue packages went in the direction, for example, of giving loans to weaker banks, giving loans, giving support to weaker governments, trying to put together rescue packages. Now, that it was done both from the monetary side. The ECB stretched its mandate to the limit, and some would say even beyond the limit. No, they did things they would never have thought possible in 1999. And the most well-known example is 2012, at the top of the Greek debt crisis, when Mario Draghi, then the president of the ECB, in a speech in London said, whatever it takes, we will do. The ECB will do whatever it takes to save the euro. No limits, no lack of any action. So that satisfied financial markets, but it clearly was a violation of the no bailout condition. It was clearly a sign that we would help other countries if they would be in trouble. And that same held for the European Union. Now, the European Union, I'll get back to that later, itself is financially a dwarf. It's almost powerless. It has no money. So any action that had to be taken had to come from the euro areas jointly. But the EU has played and is continuing to play in an increased capacity the role of lead manager, of coordinator, of trying to push countries to come together and, let's say, design a package for support. So what you see is that over the years, the influence of the EU in being this lead manager, even though we have an intergovernmental system where the countries themselves in the end decide, has grown tremendously. And in the COVID crisis, for the first time, the EU put together itself a rescue package of 750 billion euro, which is almost the size of the Dutch GDP in 1 year, and was allowed to borrow directly from financial markets to finance that. So that was again a step towards, let's say, a bigger role of the EU. Apart from the rescue packages, we also learned a few things. There were two things that we learned. One thing that we, unfortunately, so far have not learned. So what we learned was, A, the financial system can cause very large shocks itself. And B, fiscal supervision was inadequate. And we tried to overcome these two problems. So on the financial side, there was globally a push for more regulation, for more supervision and monitoring of the regulation, and if banks would fail or financial institutions would fail, a better way to let them default without severe consequences. In Europe, we took that a step further than globally, because in Europe, each country at that time still had its own regulations and its own way of dealing with this. And instead of that, we moved it up one step and we said, okay, from now on we will have financial regulation that holds for the whole of the European Union. Well, essentially for the euro area, mandatory, but the other EU countries that were not yet part of the euro area could and did voluntarily sign up to be part of that as well, to improve their policy. So we created the European Banking Union, and the ECB itself became the supervisor of the 100+ largest banks, so that if any of these would default, the first layer of losses would be borne by the rest of the large banks, but then after that, the joint euro area countries in the system would pay the price, and not individual countries that happen to have a big bank. So we essentially centralized part of that by saying it's not a country on its own, it's the collective that is liable for any problem that we see. What we did not learn was that we openly, let's say, agreed, that we openly accepted the fact that the no bailout issue was off the table. So politicians still say that every country should solve its own problems, which is not true. And actually, the financial markets know it's not true. They already did know before the first crisis hit, but they definitely know now. For instance, the Greek government can, at this point today, borrow for 10 years at an interest rate of 3.3%. The United States today borrows at an interest rate of 4.3%. Although the credit rating, the credit reputation of the United States is much better than Greece. And why can Greece borrow so cheaply? Because the markets know that if the Greek economy would go down and the Greek government would be threatened with default, Europe would step in. So the risk premium on the Greek debt is much lower than it would be if it would be on its own. So the markets don't believe this no bailout. But in the, let's say, narrative that we have publicly, it's still there. And it's, I would say, it is costly. It damages our the European Union as a project. So let's go back. Now that we know all of that, how do the optimists look to the past? So the optimists say we were right. We started out with 12 countries, now we have 20. And what we see is that popular support for the euro is high. Look at this green line. So this comes from the biannual survey that the European Commission holds across all European Union countries. And what you see is that the fat green line gives the percentage of support for the European project, for the euro and the Economic and Monetary Union, which today stands at 81% of the population. In the Netherlands, it's 89%. And the share of people that oppose is gradually going down. The other thing that the optimists will say is inflation is under control. And for that, I would like you to look at this bottom graph and specifically at the blue line. So the blue line is the average of inflation over the whole 25 years for the 12 initial euro area members. And it's 2.15%. So it's almost exactly where the ECB was, let's say, ordered to get. Now you can question whether the ECB did it perfectly, but in the end we have a 2.15% average, which is, you could say, meets the target, meets the ambitions. And even better, individual countries in this group all had an average inflation that is very close to 2%. Slightly above, slightly below, but still. So in that sense, we see there is convergence. So the optimists say, didn't we say so? Now, the pessimists say the same. Because the pessimist says, listen, we predicted crisis and collapse if needed. So there were crises, there were shocks. We predicted that we would need safety nets. And although everybody said we wouldn't have them, we created them. And they say there has not been any real convergence. So the optimists claim that because of the euro, we would automatically grow together. They say that's not true. And the proof they give, one of the proofs you could give, is again by looking at this inflation graph. So now I don't look at the blue line, but I look at the other two. So the orange line gives you the highest inflation in a given year across all the euro area members. The gray line gives you the lowest inflation in a given year across all euro area members. And what you see is that the gap between high and low inflation is at a minimum about 2%, but often is 5 or 6%. That means that countries are very different cyclically, that they have different dynamics, and that on average they are roughly doing the same, but sometimes one country is in an economic boom with high inflation, and in other periods another country is in an economic boom with high inflation. That makes monetary policy extremely tough for the European Central Bank, because the European Central Bank is charged with setting its policy on the basis of the average. But the further away individual countries are from that average, the more problematic it becomes, because these countries will face a monetary policy that does not fit them. Actually, that worsens their problem. So the pessimists say, you see, we're still having problems. And the other thing they point out is that we used to say every country in the euro area should have a government debt that is no more than 60% of its GDP. And most countries, although not all, complied with that in 1999. Now, what you see is that debt positions have deteriorated tremendously. Of course, because of all of these crises, because each time you have a crisis, the government is called upon to do something. And that raises the government debt. But if then afterwards you don't sufficiently reduce the debt, it keeps increasing, so that each time you become more vulnerable. That's not just a matter of, let's say, accounting and say, well, you know, we didn't comply with the rules. It also means that for each new crisis, the scope of action is more limited, because if you have a too high government debt, it becomes more difficult to react to a crisis to protect your economy. So we essentially have increased fiscal fragility by fighting the previous crisis. So the pessimists are much less convinced. What does that leave us with? A few things. One is that we have, you could say, we are captive customers. That's actually more a term out of the marketing, but I think, but it means that we cannot get out. And you could say, well, of course we can get out. True, we could get out. But we've seen with Brexit that the cost of getting out for the UK, which had still its own currency, was really, really high. Trying to unwind the financial integration of the euro area economies, if you would get out, is so costly that nobody wants even to think about it. I don't think that's a bad idea. So it gives you an extra commitment device to say, okay, given that we're in, we should work it out together. However, working it out together is not that easy, because we are in a situation where the mutual trust is pretty low, where countries, but also citizens of countries, do not really trust one another financially, and are we being cheated on? Do we really want to give money to somebody, etc.? So, and that is strengthened by nationalist and populist movements, by dissatisfaction. And politicians do not really contribute, because they tend to blame Europe for whatever goes wrong, so that even if they have taken the decisions themselves, because all the decisions in the European Union, of course, are in the end decisions by the European individual countries that make part of the European Union. Anyhow, so there's low trust, and we have kept the EU center very small. So for that, I want you to look at this graph. This gives you the relative size of public expenditures by the central government, that's the orange bar, and any government below that. If you look at France, as we all know, France is a very centrally organized country, then the central government determines 80% of all expenditures, public expenditures. The rest, 20%, is done by the lower level governments in France. In the Netherlands, also centrally organized, it's a bit more equal, but still central expenditures are very dominant. Then we move to Germany and the US. Both of these are federally organized countries. In the US you have 50 states, which each have to some extent their own budget authority and independence. And in Germany you have the 16 Bundesländer. And there you see there is some sort of balance between central and decentral government expenditures. And then we have the EU. Now assume that all this Euro area, all these EU countries are sort of regional governments of the European Union. Then the EU only has 2% of all public expenditures, and the rest is done, 98%, by the national governments and lower. So we have deliberately kept the EU very small. They can't move. They cannot issue bonds on their own unless permitted by the joint countries. So they have a budget. They each time they're currently trying to negotiate a higher budget, but their budget is only 1% of the total EU GDP. It's peanuts. So we have low trust. We have a very small center. We cannot get out, and we don't want to get out because being alone would be a lot worse, I think. And still we face all these external and internal threats. We have the geopolitical situation, we have the multilateral world order, we have aging, we have lack of innovation and productivity. The Draghi report of last year is an example of that. We have climate change, we have the energy transition. So you could say this, the logic of this analysis says we need more Europe, not less. And then the question is, if you would agree to that, how do we do that? So that's not an easy question, because as I said at the start of my talk, political integration is a very sensitive issue. And even if we would all want it, it's still a very long way off. Because you need legal issues, you need negotiations, you need treaty changes, etc., etc. So even though we might think that political integration would be a logical thing to do, it will take very long before we are there. The European people are a little bit schizophrenic about that. On the one hand, they don't think, and certainly the national politicians don't think, it's a good idea if we get Eurobonds. So if there would be a general issue of euro area-wide bonds borrowing from the financial markets, that is guaranteed, underwritten by all the individual countries. We are continuously blocking that. The Netherlands is one of the most severe, persistent blocking countries. We also still face veto rights on many important decisions. We could move more to qualified majority voting, for example. So our governance rules, even in the current system, are not really, let's say, optimal, I would say. Now, going in that political direction is for the moment infeasible, probably, unless we would again be hit by some external shock, which we have done tremendous things over the past 20 years when an external shock hit, so which were unimaginable before, so perhaps we would do the same if that would happen again. But I don't know whether we should long for that, so let's try to do it in a different way. So the other way is to say, okay, let's do what we always have done. Let's try to integrate them a little bit more on the economic side. And I would like you to give you one example where we can actually do that, and that is what we call risk sharing. Quite a few of my PhDs have worked on this type of topics, and I'm happy to share, let's say, not their individual work, but some of the thinking that has evolved from that. Now, all of you know what risk sharing is. You could also call it insurance. Most of you have a fire insurance on your house or car insurance on your car. And the principle is you pay a little premium. You have a small probability that you will need it. But if you need it, you get a substantial amount of money. If the system is let's say, administered in a neutral and objective way, you don't have to trust all the other participants in the system because all of them pay and you only get a payout if you really are in trouble. We also do that on the income side. So we have a social security system which ensures our income. If you get unemployed, you get, at least for some time, you get compensation. Partly, not completely, not 100%. So let me run you through that. So suppose we have somebody, this is an individual, let's say one of you, who has a income of 100. I've scaled it to 100 to make the numbers easier. You have 98% of that comes from a regular job, labor income. 2% comes from anything else. It might be interest on your savings account. It might be something you invested in stocks, so you have dividends. It could be money you get from selling second-hand goods on eBay or Vinted. Whatever works for you, it could be part of that 2%. What do you do with that money? Well, you put part of it away on a savings deposit, let's say 5%, and 95% of that you spend. All hypothetical numbers, so don't hold me to the exact numbers. What happens if you lose your income, if you get unemployed? Well, of course, if nothing would happen, you would suddenly not be able to spend anything. You wouldn't be able to buy food, drinks, housing, etc. However, we have a system. So the blue part of the system, the blue part of this, I put it at 70%, is what you get from the insurance system, the fiscal insurance. But of course you can do something yourself. You can save, so you can take part of the savings you have from previous times out of their savings deposit and use them. But also you can borrow from family or friends or banks, and you could try to raise your other income a little bit. And the total of that might cover 85% of your previous income. And that means you could still spend 85% or 85 units instead of 95. And of course, in a tough period like this, you don't save. So you just forget about saving for 1 or 2 years. So this works well on an individual basis. The question is, can we do that on a macro basis? And the answer is yes. So for example, in the United States, with 50 individual states, there's also a sort of an equalization system across the states. If one of the states loses income, so suppose the loss in one of the US states is 100, then 46% of that is compensated by income they get from other states. Can be companies that have production in other states and get profits from that. It can be savings that are put there. It can be dividends or interest rate revenues. There is some federal insurance system for 9%, and of course again they can do it themselves by borrowing or dissaving. So in the United States, an individual state that loses some part of its income can compensate in the short run for about 85%, keeping, let's say, everyday life continuing more or less normal. In Germany, roughly the same is true. So Germany has 16 Bundesländer. They also have a very intricate Bundesländer system, equalization system, and they also are able to insure about 85%. They have a slightly bigger fiscal transfer system. They have a slightly less other income system, but for the rest it's roughly the same. If you would tell the same story for the Eurozone, then we can only cover, as an individual Euro country, 27% because of these transmission channels. And the rest is just a gap, it's a fall in our income, which leads to much more social losses if it happens. So we could do better. We should be able to do better in Europe than just allowing us to do so little insurance compared to other more federally organized systems. Now, the question is, how do you do that? I'll give you an example, and it might surprise you. So, below, you see the actual growth rates of national income of Spain and Germany over the past 25 years. The blue line is Spain, the orange red bar is Germany. And what you see is that between 1999 and 2005, Spain was doing actually much better than Germany. Spain was in a boom, Germany was facing stagnation, all sorts of conflicts with labor unions, etc. After the financial crisis, where Spain was hit also by a real estate crisis, you see that Germany has much higher growth than Spain. And again, in the last couple of years, since we recovered from COVID, you see again that Spain is doing much better. Suppose we would have had in place a sort of a fiscal insurance system in Europe. Then what would have happened is that in the early period, Spain would have supported Germany. In the second period, Germany would have supported Spain, and in the last couple of years, Spain would again have supported Germany. The idea of an insurance system is that it's fair, so that means that in the end, you play even. You pay in as much as you get out, on average. But of course, in specific years, you may win or you may lose. This would have enormous benefits economically, and not only economically. So it would give better shock responses. It would dampen our economic cycle, so we would have less real estate booms and exuberant expectations of high growth. We would also have lower recessions. The second benefit is that we would have a better monetary policy, because if we do it like this, countries become more close together in terms of their inflation performance. And that makes the life easier for the European Central Bank, because their policy, then the uniform policy for everybody, will be appropriate for more countries. The gap between what is good for one country or good for all countries becomes much more, the trade-off becomes much more beneficial. And the final point, and for me I think that would be a really important point, perhaps the most important point, it would be a sort of a visible action, a visible signal of the way Europe contributes to increase welfare and contributes to a sort of a feeling of solidarity across Euro area countries. So it would not be a punishing machine that tells us which rules we have to obey, and if not, we get punished. It would give us some feeling of, if we are in trouble, we will be helped, and we would be willing to pay the price if some other country would be in trouble. And again, this does not require trust ex ante. We don't have to trust any other country. It's not a matter of structural transfers. It's a matter of, let's say, intertemporal sharing of the risk, so that in the end it hopefully would lead as one step to a little bit more trust, a little bit more solidarity, and therefore also create a platform for further integration. So is this a final countdown? Because that was the title of my speech. Well, what is final? So there is almost nothing is final in life, they say. Even my own retirement apparently was not completely final. So nevertheless, we are at a really decisive moment. We have a difficult situation internally and externally. And I mentioned already all the challenges that we face. And the question is, are we up to the challenges? Knowing that the euro ties us together, that that's a commitment device that binds us. And we know that most of the challenges we face are beyond the national borders. They are supranational challenges. What happens in the world geopolitically is not something one country can do. What happens with the climate is not something one country can do. So there's many challenges that need to be done, need to be dealt with at a more central level, or by building continuously new coalitions. Individual countries, therefore, are not really appropriate to do that. The European Union has been kept deliberately small. So it's not really in the position to do that on its own. So we do need to rethink how we want to govern Europe, and we do need to rethink how we need to set up this governance to come up with a response to sharing. And that needs a mind shift, I think, to, let's say, publicly support the idea that we are in it together, and that it's not in Europe everyone for himself, but that it should be all for one and one for all. Now, what I proposed in the risk sharing is only a first step in that, but I think there are many more initiatives that could be taken in this direction. So let me stop the economic talk and let me go to, I'm still reasonably on time, I think. So let me go to a few final words. So about 50 years ago, I started studying econometrics in Rotterdam. And I did that because it seemed to me then the perfect combination of analytical rigor, I love mathematics, and societal relevance. And I have to admit that during the first couple of years of my study econometrics, I came to the brink of dropping out because societal relevance was nowhere to be seen. However, at that point I chose what they called in Dutch Werkcollege Monetaire Economie, which was taught by Piet Korteweg and Eduard Bomhoff, and which became my specialization. And I really owe the two of them for inspiring me to become an applied economic researcher and teacher, and also for providing me with a very thorough training to be able to think and analyze as an economist, which has helped me ever since. So after my PhD in 1989, I started my personal road trip with a short stay at the Nederlandse Bank, where I got my first taste of policy advice. But then I quickly moved to Maastricht. I was hired by Johan Muisken, who is also here, and Luc Soete as an associate professor in international monetary economics. And I'm still very grateful they did so. In Maastricht, I was extremely fortunate to have Tom van Veen on my side from that point on, because Tom, you are the greatest colleague I can think of, and I thank you from my heart for the friendship and collegiality over this past long period. And my early years in Maastricht were also important in some other way. So in Rotterdam, I had been trained as a neoclassical economist with a very strong belief in, or emphasis on, depending how you want to say it, in rational behavior and market efficiency. The difference with the heterodox and post-Keynesian environment in Maastricht in the economic department could not have been larger, I think. But the confrontation was really helpful for me and inspired me to become more synergetic in approaching economics. In addition, I became involved in leadership, organization, management, which I also like to do. And Maastricht allowed me to benefit from my international network. So I spent quite a few times, long periods in the United States at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis and the Indiana Business School. And a special thought today is to Dan Thornton from the Fed, who was a very dear colleague, mentor and friend since my first visit there in 1982. And I would have loved him to be here, but he passed away, unfortunately, too early last year. Despite my happy days in Maastricht, I went to Utrecht, contributing to the building of a new economics faculty, the Utrecht University School of Economics, strongly pushed for that by Peter de Gijzel. And I took that leap into the unknown, and it proved fascinating and rewarding. So these were very nice years as well. In Utrecht, I also joined the Sustainable Finance Lab, of which many people, colleagues, are here today, which aims to contribute to the societal debate on the role of finance, on what should be the good role of finance, let me put it like that. And when the building phase in Utrecht was over, I accepted a new challenge as Deputy Director of the CPB, the Netherlands Bureau for Economic Policy Analysis. At the CPB, I really learned to enjoy and to appreciate the great culture of team research and the drive to inform policymakers through research-based policy advice. But as the Dean already said, the Pro-Rector said, Maastricht kept calling, and in 2017 I came back here. And since then I've lived here and worked here very happily, both at the Department of Macroeconomics and International Economics, which still is my home base, but also I've spent 3 years at the Department of Micro and Public Economics, and then since late 2023 I've become more and more involved in Unimerit, which I always knew when I was here in Maastricht for the first time, but never got really associated with and got close to. I'm not going to mention all of the people I worked with in these years, and which the people I enjoyed working with. I think in general, over the past 8 years, I can say I came with a smile and I went home with a smile because I really loved the university, this faculty, and the way we are working together. That goes from the dean, from the bestuurlijk overleg, where all the heads of departments come together for collegial debate, sometimes intense debate, but always constructive. It holds for all the management teams in MILE, in MPE, in Unimerit, whom I've worked with. It holds for all the support staff. It has really been a pleasure. At the start of my academic journey in 1975, I did not know what was ahead. And I do look back with sincere gratitude and satisfaction on an amazing journey. I love economics. Economics remains a fascinating, ever-developing topic with great societal relevance. And working in academia, teaching young students, as well as doing joint research, is a privilege and a responsibility. It facilitates meeting and working with many inspired and inspiring colleagues and students. Engaging with stakeholders beyond academia in policy and industry offers important opportunities to create impact. So I have so many things and colleagues to be thankful for that I'm not going to mention them, but you know who I mean. Having said that, I do want to mention a few people who made specifically this meeting possible. So that is Monique, who did all of the logistic and administration. That is Fabienne and Eveline and Willy from the Beatles office. It's Joshua from the audio and visual services who helped me prepare the slides. It's Ad Notte who made the word cloud with the social network analysis. It is Herman Pijpers who was willing to take the pictures. And of course, I want, last but not least, to thank my daughter Marit for the great illustrations that you saw during this presentation. So then the thuisfront. And I'll switch to Dutch. Lieve Marijke, wat jou betreft, hoe minder woorden, des te beter. Maar toch, 2 regels heb ik beloofd. We kwamen elkaar tegen in Rotterdam ruim 45 jaar geleden. En ik kan je niet genoeg bedanken voor alles. Je bent letterlijk en figuurlijk meegegaan op de roadtrip die ons samen op heel veel plaatsen heeft gebracht. Maar je bent ook degene die, geholpen door een flinke dosis creativiteit en onvoorspelbaarheid, mijn work-life balance in evenwicht heeft weten te houden. Lieve kinderen, Marit, Arjen en Aniek. Ik ben enorm blij met jullie. En ik ben verschrikkelijk trots op de mensen die jullie zijn geworden. En ik ben blij met jullie partners Dirk, Sas en Jaap. En dan de kleinkinderen. Lieve Lois, Wende en Eneas. Jullie hebben ontzettend stilgezeten. En het was natuurlijk heel vervelend met al het Engels dat je niet begrijpt. Maar dit was een wat lastig uur. Maar daarnaast zou ik zeggen, elk uur met jullie is een feest. En ik kijk er naar uit om daar binnenkort nog veel meer van gaan genieten dan ik nu al doe. Ik heb gezegd.
Well, thank you very much for this impressive valedictory address, not only in content, but also in format. And I think it really shows your passion and engagement with everybody in the audience here, but in general stakeholders in this field. And I think also I see another reappearance coming, because when I look through the conclusion of your entire valedictory address, the final countdown, it's the promising final countdown. And I see you going to Europe with your advice and your policy consequences of what you're trying to say. So hopefully you'll keep doing that from Maastricht also. This does not end the academic ceremony yet. I know you're all waiting to toast to these celebratory moments, but I would like to give the floor to 2 distinguished colleagues of mine, who one after the other, I assume, would also like to share something with you. It's Professor Dr. Mark Sanders and Professor Japos. Mark, the floor is yours.
Ja, Clemens. Ik ga het in het Nederlands doen. Tenminste, zo had ik het voorbereid. En allereerst ben ik heel benieuwd hoe wij die risicodeling daadwerkelijk hand en voeten gaan geven in de komende jaren. Want dat ziet er heel veelbelovend uit. We gaan al even terug samen. Om niet te zeggen dat letterlijk mijn hele werkende leven beslaat. Mijn relatie met jou. Inclusief de opleiding hier in Maastricht. Dus ik ben heel blij dat ik hier nu in deze toga zelfs en in deze zaal even afscheid van je mag nemen, voorlopig. Dat had ik niet durven vermoeden toen wij elkaar voor het eerst tegenkwamen in begin jaren 90, 91, toen ik hier begon te studeren. En in die tijd samen, ik heb je vooral meegemaakt als bestuurder en als wetenschapper. Want ik ben niet bij je gepromoveerd. Jaap zal er daar nog wel wat dingen over zeggen. Maar altijd in de buurt geweest. En we zijn samen van hier naar Utrecht gegaan. En dat was voor jou misschien tussen de bedrijven door, maar voor mij heel belangrijk. Dus ik wil je daar nog erg voor bedanken. Je bent streng op de inhoud en betrokken op de persoon. Je was niet altijd mijn directe leidinggevende, maar wel vaak. En in ieder geval altijd in de buurt met raad en advies. En voor anekdotes hoef ik niet in mijn archieven te duiken, want die staan me nog vele bij uit die tijd. Al heel vroeg tijdens mijn PhD hier in Maastricht kwam van jou de opmerking dat ik misschien een te druk sociaal leven zou hebben om wetenschapper te kunnen worden. En dat had ik kunnen opvatten als kritiek natuurlijk, maar daar kwam die lach bij, die spottende glimlach die je er dan bij hebt opgezet. En ik denk, nou ja, misschien vindt hij het ook wel grappig om te zien hoe dat dan afloopt. Dus ik heb daar eigenlijk ook niks aan gedaan. En dat kritische, spottende lachje kwam ook toen ik in Utrecht, geloof ik, was het een keer in een functioneringsgesprek, had je gevraagd van, nou, zet nou eens even alles waar je aan werkt op papier, doe dat eens in een overzicht. Dan kan ik een beetje kijken waar je mee bezig bent. En toen had ik een spreadsheet gemaakt met, ik geloof, 50 plus projecten. Waarbij jij ook weer zei van, ja, gast, ben je er mee bezig? Focus, breng eens focus aan, probeer eens te kiezen. Maar dat heb je me nooit afgedwongen. En je stond open voor die keuze om dat niet te doen. En dan was meer de houding van, nou, laat maar zien dan dat het wel kan. En dat is een beetje jouw houding. Je bent niet snel overtuigd. En als je jou wil overtuigen, moet je met deugdelijk bewijs komen. En dat kenmerkt jou als wetenschapper en dat kenmerkt jou als leidinggevende. Ik herinner me ook nog een moment na mijn promotiediner toen Sarah je ondervroeg over mijn onderwijslasten in Utrecht. Dat zal je misschien ook nog bijstaan. Ik vond het in ieder geval een heel indrukwekkend moment. Maar daar kwam ook jouw reactie op van, nou ja, als je vindt dat je te veel moet doen. En dat was helemaal niet eigenlijk, nou ja. Ik werkte in Utrecht, zal het u even vertellen, als docent. Maar we hadden ook een huis gekocht, dus ik was heel druk met verbouwen. En die combinatie was moeilijk, dus daar klaagde ik dan thuis wel eens over. Maar ja, voor verbouwen word je natuurlijk door de Universiteit Utrecht niet betaald. En toen heb jij droogjes opgemerkt van, nou, weet je, tijdens dat diner, zet het dan maar weer eens op papier. Kom maar door met de cijfers. En toen heb ik dat spreadsheet gemaakt, maar je hebt het nooit gezien, want daar kwam eigenlijk uit dat ik precies op mijn urenlast zat. Dus ik denk, nou ja, dan hoef ik daar ook niet meer op terug te komen. Maar goed, die open houding, dus open voor kritiek, maar dan altijd ook terugkomen met, nou ja, laat maar zien dan, kom maar met het bewijs, anders ben ik niet convinced. En die zin, nou ja, die komt misschien vandaag ook nog wel vaker terug. Bij het SFL kennen ze me in ieder geval. Daar zijn we inhoudelijk ook samen gaan werken. De financiële we zaten helemaal niet op hetzelfde terrein. Toen ik hier begon met onderwijs geven, heb je me nog eens gevraagd van waarom heb je eigenlijk nooit bankingcursussen gedaan? Ik zei, ja, banking, geld, dat is toch helemaal niet interessant. De reële economie, innovatie, dat is leuk. Maar toen was jouw vervolgvraag, ja, maar wil je het wel geven? Nou ja, graag, want ik kies niet. Dus ik heb ook bankingvakken met je gegeven. Maar nooit inhoudelijk samengewerkt. Tot bij SFL eigenlijk. De financiële crisis maakte mij wel duidelijk dat de financiën, finance, monetary policy, dat toch wel iets interessants zou kunnen zijn. En dat is gebleken. Maar grappig genoeg, ik heb nog wel even zitten kijken. Er staan 195 publicaties van jou op Google Scholar. En daar zit er 1 bij, waar mijn naam ook op staat. 1 samen met Harald in het Financiële Dagblad, een opiniestuk. En dat heeft denk ik te maken met de manier waarop jij graag je voetafdruk in de wetenschap zet. Dat moet degelijk, dat moet stevig onderbouwd. Dat kan niet op basis van een goede argumentatie, daar moet ook bewijs bij. En nou ja, de iets wat misschien te activistische toon van veel van de stukken in het SFL, afgezien van het feit dat je vanuit je posities daar vaak ook niet meteen je handtekening onder kon zetten, maakte dat er dus bij 1 gebleven is. Nou, die koester ik dan. Maar goed, jij hebt wel 195 met die manier van doen tot een enorme indrukwekkende lijst van papers over financiële en monetaire onderwerpen geschreven. Een hele kritische houding aan het begin, jegens de euro. Geleidelijk aan veel meer betrokken en positief. Dus ik vond vandaag de draai ook heel mooi. Of de hoopvolle boodschap richting Europa. En ik heb dat ook wel altijd als een belangrijke richting gezien. En ik hoop dat we die combinatie van klimaatschokken, veerkracht, monetair financieel beleid, dat tot nog wat leuke dingen kan gaan opleveren in de komende jaren. Omdat Brenda er vandaag niet kan zijn namens het SFL, heeft ze me gevraagd om ook namens SFL iets te zeggen. Dat past, zoals ik al zei, naadloos in het plaatje. Niet vaak stond je per se in de spotlights of voorop de publicaties, maar als meedenker, kritisch tegenligger, was je altijd constructief. En je wist eerst Rens en toen mij en later ook de medewerkers tot wanhoop, maar ook tot grotere hoogte op te stuwen met het bekende ik ben nog niet overtuigd. Zonder uitzondering zijn de publicaties en publieksavonden van SFL door jouw betrokkenheid beter geworden dan ze zonder inbreng zouden geweest zijn. Of dat nu uiteindelijk zichtbaar was aan jouw naam eronder of niet. Dus ook namens het SFL grote dank daarvoor. En misschien dat Rens dadelijk bij de receptie nog iets wil zeggen. Dan namens mezelf, ik sluit daar graag mee af. Als het mij gelukt is om zonder inhoudelijke focus toch iets van mijn academische carrière te maken, dan is dat te danken, niet in de laatste plaats, aan die constante in mijn carrière die jij bent geweest. Dus Clemens, grote dank voor je steun, voor je advies, voor je spottende glimlach, voor je rake kritiek. Ik ben blij dat ik tot hier met je heb mogen oplopen en ik hoop dat nu je dadelijk in vrijheid kunt kiezen welke paden je bewandelt, je dat ook nog steeds met mij zult willen doen. Dank je wel. En Jaap wil nog wat zeggen.
Tja, je zult maar daarna moeten spreken. Clemens, toen Mark en ik het over vandaag hadden, toen zei ik tegen Mark, ik wil graag over Clemens de leraar praten. Want dat voelt het meest senang. Toen ik net als AIO begonnen was, kan ik me herinneren dat we in een van onze vele gesprekken over rules versus discretion, die vond op de gang plaats, was een verhit gesprek, dat je uiteindelijk wegliep, want je moest ergens naartoe, en omdraaide en zei, ik spreek je wel als je ouder en wijzer bent. Nou, ouder ben ik. En ik zal er zo op terugkomen. In de jaren sinds dat gesprek heb ik zelf, voor mijn gevoel, als ik belangrijke beslissingen moest nemen, vaak aan dat gesprek teruggedacht. En dat doe ik eigenlijk nog steeds wel. En eerlijk antwoord, dat zou je niet verbazen, ik denk dat ik niet zo anders in die discussie sta toen als dat ik nu sta. Maar daar gaat het eigenlijk niet helemaal niet om. Waar het wel om gaat is dat kritisch denken, ook en vooral richting jezelf, Dat heb ik en heel veel andere AIO's en studenten van jou meegekregen. En daar ben ik heel dankbaar voor. Ik was, toen ik in Maastricht kwam, in mijn eerste jaar, een beetje een verloren student. Ik dacht, dit is helemaal niet wat ik wil. Een beetje hetzelfde als wat je net ook al zei. Van, ja, waar is de maatschappelijke betrokkenheid? Waar gaat dit over? En als je dan zo door het gebouw in de Tongsterstraat rondloopt, dan was een docent als jij een redding. Je was bevlogen, inhoudelijk supersterk en didactisch echt top. Dat vond ik toen en dat vind ik nog. Het was eigenlijk niet eens zozeer wat je doseerde, want ik ben uiteindelijk helemaal geen monetair econoom geworden. Maar vooral hoe. En voor studenten, en dat geldt misschien nu nog wel veel meer dan toen, die meer wilden dan alleen maar een tentamen halen, was het een zegen om eindelijk eens iemand voor zich te hebben die zelf ook de indruk gaf dat het tentamen vooral een bijzaak was. Nog steeds vind ik economie leuk als het een mooie intuïtie kan geven die analytisch correct is voor een fenomeen dat in eerste instantie totaal niet intuïtief is. En dat heb ik 100% aan jou als docent te danken. Rigor, toeval bestaat niet, het staat hier ook. Ik weet niet zo goed hoe ik het in één Nederlandse term kan vertalen. Maar het beschrijft wel in één woord wat ik denk dat je vooral meegeeft als docent. Zeker wanneer je over onderzoek doseert. Check, check en nog eens check. Leer cijfers te lezen. Leid zelf af. Ga terug naar de bron en lees de klassiekers. Dat gekoppeld aan een bijna Socratische manier van lesgeven zorgt ervoor dat je AIO's en hun AIO's en hun AIO's, want zo gaat dat, in het DNA in elkaars werk herkennen. Als ik een AIO tegenkom die is opgeleid door een AIO van Clemens, dan zie ik dat aan het onderzoek wat die AIO doet. Dat is mooi om te zien. Toen ik zelf ging lesgeven en zelf ook verantwoordelijk werd voor vakken, nam die bewondering voor jou als docent alleen maar toe. Ik leg het fenomeen Clemens-kritiek niet uit aan mijn huidige studenten, maar ze krijgen die kritiek wel. En ik hoop uiteraard dat ze er net zoveel van leren als dat ik ervan geleerd heb. Eerlijk, die bewondering leidde ook wel eens tot verwondering. Waarom ambieert iemand die zo fantastisch les kan geven zozeer een leidinggevende functie? Wat is aantrekkelijk in beleidswerk? Die laatste vraag heb ik me wellicht niet als enige gesteld. Kleine anekdote, er zitten hier wat mensen die DNB-connecties hebben. Hoe vaak ik als AIO van jou bij DNB werkend, terwijl niet de vraag heb gekregen hoe lang ik dan wel dacht te blijven. Voor wie wil weten waar deze anekdote vandaan komt, vraag ik dadelijk maar aan Clemens. Als promovendus kwam ik achter een andere hele belangrijke kant van jou als docent en onderzoeker. Ik vond het misschien wat meer dan de meeste promovendi wel leuk om een beetje door het gebouw te zwerven en ook eens bij andere afdelingen mijn licht op te steken. En als ik dat deed, dan was altijd de vraag, en wie ben jij dan? En dan was mijn standaard antwoord, ik ben een AIO van Clemens. En dat was fantastisch, want dat opende deuren. Dan wilde iedereen met je praten. Even, staat niet in de script, maar op een persoonlijke noot. Wat ik ook waardeer is, hoezeer we soms ook wel van mening verschillen, dat op een aantal cruciale momenten, ik kan me een SKO-discussie in Utrecht herinneren, ik kan me ook menige discussie met onze vorige decaan herinneren, die een van de weinigen was die naast me ging staan. En dat waardeer ik enorm. We hebben ook samen les gegeven. Ik weet niet of je dat kunt herinneren, maar toen ik terugkwam naar Utrecht, toen ik terugkwam naar het academische en in Utrecht ging werken, gaven we samen les. En ik kan me een fietstocht herinneren. Voor degenen die daar niet gewerkt hebben, wij werkten op een andere plek dan waar we les gaven. En tijdens die fietstocht uitte ik mijn frustratie. Want ik zag je voor het eerst sinds lange tijd weer lesgeven. En ik dacht, verdorie, hij komt weg met dingen, daar zou ik nooit mee wegkomen. En toen ik dat tegen je zei je, ja, wacht maar af tot je zelf oud en grijs bent, dan lukt jou dat ook. Nou ja, feitelijk kon ik toen al niet echt grijs worden. Maar ik snap wel wat je bedoelt. Een laatste anekdote die wellicht juist nu toepasselijk is. Ik weet niet of je hem zelf kunt herinneren, maar ik vermoed van wel. De borrel na afloop van de promotie van onze eerste gezamenlijke AIO, Michael Kutter. Ik had het gisteren met hem erover. We zaten met hem en zijn vrienden en familie samen. En iemand vroeg hoe het nou was om te promoveren. En Michael zei, nou, een van de dingen die ik soms wel echt heel moeilijk vind, is dat je raakt er zo in betrokken en je bent er zo door gepassioneerd dat ja, je kunt het eigenlijk niet loslaten. Je ligt 's nachts nog te denken van hoe ga ik dat probleem nou oplossen? En hij keek vervolgens jou en mij aan en ik gaf hem een begripvolle knipoog. En jij gaf hem de reactie, nee hoor, afsluiten. Morgen is gewoon weer een werkdag. dat afsluiten gaat je blijkbaar zelf ook iets minder makkelijk af dan dat je toen aangaf. Maar ik hoop zeker dat het lukt. En een van de dingen die ik tegen mijn eigen AU's altijd zeg, is je moet zorgen, als je zo van je werk houdt, dat je genoeg opportunity cost hebt. Dat ieder moment dat je achter je bureau zit en je bent zo heel hard aan het werk, dat je denkt, ik zou ook iets anders kunnen doen. En dat het andere ook interessant genoeg is, want dat hou je die balans, waar je zelf ook net al naar verwees. Ik denk dat je ervoor gezorgd hebt, en je familie hier aanwezig is daar bewijs van, dat die opportunity cost enorm hoog was. Dat heb je hartstikke goed gedaan. Ik hoop dat je daar nu ook extra nog van kunt genieten. En hopelijk kom je ooit nog eens een keer een gastles geven, of misschien beter gezegd een masterclass. Dank je wel. Dat gezegd hebbende is er nog een allerlaatste iets, Mark. In het diepste geheim, de afgelopen maanden, zijn Mark en ik met iets anders bezig geweest. Mark gaat jou dat nu overhandigen. Het is een Liber Amicorum, waar een aantal van de mensen hier aanwezig en een aantal mensen niet hier aanwezig met heel veel nijverheid aan hebben bijgedragen. We hopen dat je ervan geniet. Dan heb je in ieder geval iets leuks te lezen wat zeer geïnspireerd is door jou in de komende tijd. Dank je wel.
Dan eindig ik ook in het Nederlands, want ik denk dat de afgelopen periode sinds 4 uur was het, een heel mooi beeld heeft gegeven. Ook al is het dan nog steeds geen afscheid, maar een heel mooi beeld heeft gegeven van Clemens als docent, Clemens als onderzoeker, Clemens als collega en Clemens als leidinggevende en collega. En dan is het nu echt tijd om daar ook samen op te proosten. En dat doen we om de hoek in de van natuurlijk airconditioning voorziene tuin. Er wordt altijd gevraagd, en ik weet dat het nooit lukt, maar er wordt altijd gevraagd om niet een receptierij te vormen, maar gewoon een drankje te nemen en dan vervolgens Clemens op te zoeken. Dus bij deze nogmaals dat verzoek. En hierbij sluit ik ook deze academische zitting.